Unit 3, 4 essential terms to fully understand Abraham's importance. The Abrahamic Covenant we talked about last unit. We went through it, right? And how we'd summarize that the Abrahamic Covenant is God's promise to create a nation from the family of Abram, and that nation is to be a blessing to the world, right? That was the summary of Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, where God makes his 7 I will promises to Abram based on Abram's obedience to leave the land, right? All part of the Abrahamic Covenant, right? But this word, there's a specific word in here that we should pause and say, wait, what does that mean, right? And that is this one. Like, what is the word? What is meant by a blessing, right? And so we want to ask the question, what is meant by a blessing? How is Abram a blessing? And how is this nation to be a blessing? So specifically, what is meant by that? Well, let's if we look at the events of Abraham's life, right? He's not Abraham yet. God will change his name. We'll see that. But if we look at in chapter 13, we left off where Lot and Abram basically split and part ways, right? Lot goes near Sodom, and Abram goes the different direction in the land of Canaan. Right after that, there's a tribal war that breaks out. Lot gets captured. It's all in Genesis 14, and Abram rescues him. And then it's at age 75. God tells Abram, right, that he is going to have a son, and he reaffirms his land. He kind of revisiting what we just read earlier in Genesis 13. He reaffirms the land, and he does this thing called cutting a covenant, which is basically at that time they would have a covenant where they would make a sacrifice, and they would cut the sacrifice in two, and they would kind of walk in a figure 8 motion between the two pieces of the offering, repeating the terms of the covenant. Well, what's interesting is God puts Abram to sleep and kind of goes it alone, as if to say that this covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, is not a conditional covenant. Abram is a beneficiary of the covenant, but this is an unconditional covenant. This is something that God alone is responsible for. And so we'll see how this is repeated as we go on. But after that, a really important thing happens, and this is in Genesis 15:6. So in Genesis 15, he reaffirms the land. He tells him that he's actually going to have a son. He said, because before he just told him he's going to have descendants, but now he actually says, you are going to have a son from your own loins, right? And so, but in verse 15:6, it's a really important thing that happens. And this is where God declares Abram as righteous. And now this is one of those verses that are absolutely paramount to understanding everything that comes forward. So right now what we're doing is we're heading into important territory. And so before we go any further, what we want to do is we need to understand 4 theological terms, 4 key theological terms that will help us in our understanding of what comes next. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the definition of the term, and I want to see if you can guess it, and then I'll show it as to what it is. So I'm going to give you the definition, and then you say what it is. And I'm going to trust that I'm going to hear you from afar. I don't know, but it's going to be cool. Anyways, so this is the first one. This is the first definition: the state of being in good moral standing with God. Even if you want to pause the video and think about that, okay? Because I'm going to keep moving. But what is it called when we are in a state of being in good moral standing with God? This is called righteousness, right? There's probably a more technical definition, but we're going to go with this one for now. It's just a state of being good with God, being in good moral standing with God. Okay, here's the second one: being declared righteous by God based on trust and not on merit. What is it called to be declared righteous by God based on trust and not based on merit? This is called justification. So the term justification is when God declares someone righteous, not based on their works, but based on their trust. Here's the third one: the definition: the personal experience of righteousness in our lives. So what is it called when we personally experience righteousness, or we experience what it means to be on good terms with God? This is called blessedness. So we hear this term throughout the Bible, and what it refers to is the personal experience of righteousness. So let's pause there. We did 3 of them, right? These were the 3 definitions that we gave. So let's review them again, right? Being in good moral standing with God is righteousness. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to call this one the goal. This is really the goal, right? We talked about the problem earlier on in module 3 when we talked about the fall. The fall has separated us from God, right? It has made us unrighteous. So the goal is to get back to righteousness. right? So the personal experience of righteousness, we said, is called blessedness. This is the result. So the result of being righteous is blessedness. That's what happens when we get to the goal. Justification is the third one. That is what it means to be declared righteous by God. And this is the requirement. So the requirement, what we need, is to be justified. We need to be declared righteous by God because we can't earn it ourselves. We are in sin and we are separated from God. So we need Him to declare us righteous in order for us to become righteous. We'll learn about that a little bit more later. But now we've got 3 boxes kind of filled in, right? And we got this 4th one. So really the question that matters now is, what is the means? Or another way of saying is, how do we access righteousness? If righteousness is the goal and blessedness is the result and justification is the requirement, how do we get it? How do we access it? And this is where Genesis 15 really, really matters and helps us in this discussion. So if we go back a couple verses to verse 4, let's look at the context of the discussion. So God and Abram are discussing the terms of the Abrahamic Covenant, right? And Abraham knows that his wife Sarah is barren, and so he doesn't have a son, and so he's thinking, okay, well, if I'm going to have descendants, it's going to have to be through somebody else, right? So he was thinking, well, the next in line in my house is Eliezer of Damascus, so it must be through him that you're going to make these descendants, right? Because clearly it can't be through Sarah and I, because Sarai, as her name is still, is barren, and we don't have any kids. And here's where we pick up in the discussion. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this one shall not be your heir, speaking of Eliezer. But, and then God makes it very specific to Abram, one who shall come from your own body shall be your heir, which must have been crazy to hear because that has been impossible up until this point. And remember, Abram is 75 years old. Verse 5, he says, then he brought him outside and he said, this is God speaking to Abram, look now toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them. And he said, so shall your descendants be, which must have been crazy for Abram to hear, right? Because let's just pause for a second and look at what's happened so far. So at age 75, God asked Abram to leave his homeland without telling him where he was supposed to go, right? Whose wife has been unable to have children their whole lives. And he promises him that he's going to have a son, that he's going to inherit enemy land, right? Because it's currently being overtaken by the Canaanites, and that his descendants will fill the earth. Now just think about that for a second. That's crazy. But the even crazier part is that he obeys. Abram obeys God despite everything on the surface just being impossible, right? And so that's why this verse is so important. And if we go back to verse 5, it says he shows him the stars, right? He says, look towards heaven, count the stars. This is how your descendants are going to be. They're going to be this many. He says, so shall your descendants be. And how does Abram respond? This is why verse 6 is so important. It says, he believed in the Lord, and he, being God, accounted it to him for righteousness. Now, man, this is such an important verse, as we're going to see. But he says he believed in the Lord. And this word believed is actually the Hebrew word Ha'emin, I think is how you say it. But it's the idea of trust. And as we're going to see later that this verse gets quoted in the New Testament, it's not just that he believed in God, kind of the natural way people think. No, believe means to trust in. And that is going to be the clue for how we answer our question right here. Because we left with the question, how do we access righteousness, right? So this one is the means. What is our means to righteousness? And the means to righteousness is active trust and obedience to God. So what do we call the combination of someone who has an active trust combined with obedience, like Abram has displayed? What do we call that? What does the Bible call that? Whereas a very specific word, and that word is faith. Faith means active trust combined with obedience to God. And so this slide here is going to be very important for us to understand as we go forward, right? So what's cool about this actually is that these four actually have a natural relationship. So check this out. So we have the requirement is justification. We need to be declared righteous. Well, the way that we access that is through faith, through active trust and obedience. The goal for that is to get to righteousness, which is good moral standing with God. And then the result of being righteous is blessedness. It's the result. It is the personal experience of righteousness. Now, if you remember, I showed you this slide, or we talked about this slide earlier, and this was kind of our rap sheet for sin. This is the result of sin in our lives. Now, what's really interesting about this, right, if we take these numbers off, because the order was just kind of how we had it before, and we swap the order of some of these, what's fascinating is that these four concepts, these four key theological ideas that we're talking about in this unit actually directly solve the four problems that we have as sinners before a holy God. Check this out, right? So we owe God a debt of sin, right? We've broken his law. We are in debt. Well, guess what? If we are justified, then Christ has paid our debt. If we've been declared righteous, we don't have a debt anymore, right? Check out this one. We are in bondage to Satan, right? We serve Satan instead of serving God. Well, guess what? Through active trust and obedience, what we call faith, we place our trust in God. We don't serve Satan anymore, right? We place our trust and we serve the Lord, right? The third one, we've offended God's character, right? Mankind, we've rejected God's rulership and we've incurred his wrath. Well, guess what? If we are righteous, guess what? There's no barriers between God and man anymore. We're good. We are in morally good standing with God. And the last one is that we're spiritually dead, right? We're disconnected and unplugged. Well, guess what? If we are blessed, we are the exact opposite. We're alive in God. We experience righteousness, peace, and joy. So isn't that amazing that these four concepts are the solution to our sin problem? And we see it first show up in this amazing verse, Genesis 15:6, right? And we talked about the law of first mention and how sometimes when a key significant word is first mentioned, it's a clue to its meaning throughout the rest of the text. So if you think back, the first mention of grace was with Noah. Then this is the first mention of this word righteousness. And what's amazing about this particular verse is that 3 of the 4 theological concepts that we just mentioned are here. Check this out. It says he believed. Right there we see which one? Active trust and obedience. Right here where it says that God accounted it to him accounted it to him, that's justification. And then righteousness is, of course, righteousness. So we see 3 of the 4 of these important theological terms in this one very important verse. But that raises a question, right? Where's the 4th one? Where does it discuss the idea of blessedness? So we understand the active trust and obedience that Abram showed. We understand how God accounted it to him. That's kind of the Old Testament version of justification. Same meaning, though. And we are introduced to this concept of righteousness. But what about the idea of blessedness? Where is that, right? Well, what's so cool is that our friend, the Apostle Paul, is going to connect this amazing idea for us. So in the next unit, in Unit 4, we are going to examine this idea of blessing, because what's so cool is how the Apostle Paul wraps this concept in when he quotes Abraham in Romans chapter 4. So if you would, join me in Unit 4 for the blessing of Abraham from Romans 4.